The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our monthly webinar. I'm going to go ahead here and try to share my screen. Actually, George, what would I be listed as if I logged in under the account? Am I sharing my screen currently? I can't tell. Oh, wait, there we go. I think I am sharing my screen now. There we go. All right. Sorry about that. Okay, there's always some type of technical issue here. Welcome to our webinar. I'm very excited that this topic is bringing closure to lessons with productive summaries, and we're going to get to it in a few minutes. Just as way of intro, though, I want to remind everyone that these webinars are brought to you by ICTM members. So it's membership that allows us to provide professional development opportunities to teachers in the state. And so if you're not yet a member, we would encourage you to go to ictm.org and look into the benefits of membership. And it's $35 a year, but that little bit of money helps us do a lot. I actually do want to pop over quickly to the website, though, just to show you a couple of things in ways of announcements as well. If you weren't aware, you can, if you go to resources and ICTM webinars, here you'll find how to sign up for future webinars. And then there's also links to recordings of all of our past webinars. So this is kind of developing into quite a resource of PD on different topics. So we encourage you to check that out. Also, if you are an ICTM member, reminder that voting is going on right now, and it goes until April 15th. And also, until the end of this month, you can nominate somebody for a ICTM award. So something to consider as well. As intro of myself, I'm Annie Forrest. I'm on the ICTM board, and then I also manage our social media and our webinars. The way that this platform works for the webinar, if you've never joined us for one, it's a little different than maybe some other webinars you might have seen. There's a spot to ask questions. Those questions come to me as the moderator, and then I'll sort of curate questions and ask them of the speaker. Other attendees will not see your questions, so you can be as candid as you would like, and they basically just come to me. And if you have questions during, you can either post them. Anna's also going to save a little bit of time at the end. When we're finished with the webinar, when she's done with her presentation and we've had a time for questions, at the conclusion, there'll be a short survey. So we would really appreciate it if you would take the time to fill out that survey. It helps us just figure out what you liked and what we need to do in the future. And then also there'll be a follow-up email coming to you in one day. If you are watching this webinar live, you'll have an opportunity to actually fill out a Google form, and then evidence of completion will be sent to you. So if you would like PD credit for attending live, and if you are not attending live but you registered for this, then you'll get a follow-up email with the link to the recording. So that's kind of how the platform works. With that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker and so we can get started. So Anne serves as an instructional coach and professional development leader for numerous schools with the Metro Chicago Mathematics Initiative. She taught middle school mathematics in Chicago Public Schools for 10 years, where she also served as a teacher leader at the school, network, and district levels, and was a math team coach for students. She's a Yale National Initiative Fellow in 2012 and 2014, and she's a founding member of the Chicago Math Teacher Circle with Loyola University. She is passionate about supporting equity and access for both students and teachers and loves math talks. So I am going to go ahead and turn over the screen to her.
Okay.
Hopefully.
Thank you, Annie.
Okay. And we'll go ahead and get started.
All right. Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. This topic is one that is very near and dear to my heart. So while I'm kind of doing an introduction, just go ahead and type into the chat box or the question box if you are familiar with lesson closure, lesson summaries, and if you're doing them. So familiar, yes or no, implementing them, yes or no? And then Annie will share that in a couple of minutes. So this topic has been something that was probably my greatest challenge as a classroom teacher, to figure out how to do this effectively. And it's something that now in my role as a coach, a lot of my teachers are also trying to figure out and trying to work on and get better at. So I'm going to try to share with you some of the things that have worked for me. And I'm figuring out this platform as we go, so bear with me. So this quote from NCTM's Taking Action really sums up a lot of what I think about when it comes to the importance of lesson closure or summarizing. Mathematical tasks that promote reasoning and problem solving are necessary, but not sufficient for eliciting student thinking. So when we think about all of our planning and all of the things that go into these things, if you are a part of the math Twitter blogosphere or are otherwise involved in professional learning networks, a lot of time is spent on finding these cool tasks, doing these cool tasks, and thinking about these cool tasks. But the connection has to be made where we are promoting the sense making, and the closure is where that happens in a lot of lessons. So when I started teaching, it was very much pre-Common Core, but the buzzword of the time was rigor. And so everyone was kind of scrambling to figure out, how do we increase rigor? And so we got new instructional materials, we got access to a lot of tasks, but that was the focus, was getting the materials. The focus then later became, how do we actually implement these tasks in a way that helps kids make sense? So I'm going to pause and let Annie tell me kind of where we are with the little survey we did about how familiar people are with summaries before I continue.
Sorry, I am taking a look at
You're fine.
these. It's kind of running the gamut.
Okay.
So slightly yes, 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 no, not sure, no. So
All right.
the average is
That's good to know. All right, good. Well, that makes some of these slides more relevant, so that's good. So just to give a little bit more background, one of the things that my school adopted at that time was connected mathematics, and so we were using a curriculum that was very much problem-centered. And I had the luxury of having a math specialist in my school at that time, and he was working with me on how to structure these lessons and how to implement them. And it was really exciting. There were these amazing conversations happening during class. Kids were, talking in groups, and they were really excited about the math. And then I just couldn't figure out why the next day it was as if the day before had never happened. And so I kind of went through this pattern where I was seeing this really great conversation in class, but then it wasn't sticking. And, I was surprised on assessments and not seeing them remembering things that I clearly heard them talking about in math. So the math specialist I was working with at that time helped me realize that it was because I was missing closure to my lessons. I wasn't leaving enough time for the summary at the end of my class periods to really solidify what kids were supposed to learn that day and give them a takeaway or something to act upon so that they would remember. When I was putting together some professional development recently, I came across this forgetting curve. And Herman Ebbinghaus was a researcher in the late 1800s, and he did some memory studies on himself because he was trying to prove that repetition increased the strength of your memory. And he came up with this relationship that when we first learn something, we understand it, we walk away with all of this understanding. By the next day, if we haven't reviewed it or we haven't done something to commit it to memory, we've already lost about 20% of what we knew the day before. By 3 days, the forgetting curve takes us to just 60% of what we knew 3 days earlier. So this really stuck with me because that's what I was seeing with my classes. the idea that has sprung from a lot of this research has been talk about distributive practice. So trying to bring the practice over time to help kids remember these things. I see it as a really great connection to lesson summaries, because the lesson summaries are enabling students to demonstrate that they have learned. It surfaces some misconceptions that come up, they form coherent takeaways, and it reinforces and connects representations and strategies around big ideas. We are in a time in education right now where I feel like there's a lot of long-term planning, unit plans going on. And so we definitely see the big ideas. As teachers, we're seeing it in our planning, but summaries help us to illuminate those big ideas for students and help them to make sense of how all of this math fits together. When we summarize, we also are activating the mathematical practices. So a lot of times, and definitely in my early practice, we were focused around the dialogue and getting students to talk, getting students to make sense of each other's reasoning, and to just have discourse going on in our classrooms. So I use the improv spiel of yes and. So yes and is acknowledging that, because that is a really important component of a lesson summary. But if we do summaries purposefully, then we're really able to activate especially number SMPs 2, 7, and 8, where kids are really making sense of these structures and looking for the repeated reasoning. They're able to build this understanding of the mathematics that is deeper and more solid than it would be if we were only focusing on the discourse. When we think about NCTM's position on eliciting and using evidence of student thinking, the goal here is to have student presentations build on one another to develop powerful mathematical ideas. So we don't want to just have kids get up and share what they did. When I was early on in trying to implement summaries, that's what I did. I would choose groups and they would just share what they did. And my number one question was, what did you do? Can you explain your strategy? How did you know? Things like that. And I wasn't really connecting them to one another. So I learned that the teacher is the person that has to create the conditions to make the ideas visible and explicit. And a summary allows us to do that. So one of the resources that has been really pivotal in my teaching career has been this book, The 5 Practices for Orchestrating Productive Mathematics Discussions. So these are the 5 practices that they talk about. And I learned over time that there was more to it. So I had to add that first, I really needed to be clear about my goals. If I wasn't clear on what my goal of the lesson was and I was just trying to implement the task as it was, then I didn't know what kids were supposed to get out of it. And then selecting the appropriate task does have to happen, but it's not the only thing. They end with connecting in the 5 practices, and I've added close and then practice and extend. And we're going to get into a lot more detail about what each of those is in a little bit. So I'm going to pause right now and see if anyone has questions that you would like to ask after this brief intro of just kind of setting the groundwork for heading into talking about summaries.
So there hasn't been any questions as you're talking, but if people have questions, go ahead and type them in and we can make sure we talk about them.
Okay. I'll give you a moment to do that.
Somebody said, how important is it for students to have a sense of the whole as they move forward?
For students to have a sense of the whole as they move forward, I'm going to interpret that question a little bit. So what that means to me is the whole picture of like a unit plan. And I think that there's different opinions on this. One opinion is that giving them everything at the beginning is really helpful. So backward design, Wiggins and Mittig talk a lot about having the end in mind and making that end visible to kids. I think that sometimes that's appropriate, but I think that more often we are being responsive to where students are along the way. So I think about goal-directed teaching and horizon-directed teaching. So goal-directed teaching, GOAL, is really explicitly trying to teach a specific thing to every kid and have every kid get the same thing out of that lesson. So if a lesson is goal directed, where I really want everyone to take away this one thing, for example, I really want everyone to be able to graph a linear equation, that would be a goal directed lesson. And so in that case, I would say yes, I would want kids to know that that's what they're supposed to be able to do at the end of this. A horizon directed lesson is more about the big picture. And so these are those open-ended tasks where kids are exploring and they're making sense around big ideas. I think a lot about slope in that case, where kids are trying to get a conceptual understanding of what slope is. They might be playing around with some different representations and trying to make connections between graphs and equations. There's a lot of playfulness. There's a lot of just discoveries happening. So in that case, I don't have a closed goal or a big picture goal for them. So I don't think it's as important in those cases for them to really be able to articulate the objective. I know a lot of times, we have observers come into our rooms and their measure of a good lesson is if they walk up to a kid and ask, what are you learning today, that they can really clearly articulate it. I think that a better question would be, what are you thinking about today? Or what questions do you have today? That leaves it more open for kids to make sense of something in a more unstructured way. So I hope that didn't sound like a cop-out and that kind of answers your question. But I think that it's different depending on the goal of your lesson.
Yeah, I think that's great. I had never thought about goal-directed versus horizon-directed, just personally. I think that's really helpful to understand that there's those two different perspectives and what that means. So thank you.
Yeah, I think we've shifted a lot in math education, and we can't forget that there still are goal-directed lessons. We want to spend a lot of time on the horizon, but we do have to bring closure, which is the theme of today, and make sure that we're drawing some of those connections along the way. So, all right. Any other burning questions right now, Annie, or shall I continue?
Yeah, I think you can keep going.
Okay. So we're going to try a task because I think that the best way for me to really get across what I mean by summarizing a lesson is to demonstrate it. So I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to take a look at this problem and think about how you would solve it. So there's 2 questions within that problem, and I just want you to take a minute and solve it. So work on it on your own. I'll be quiet, and then we'll continue on in 2 minutes. All right, so my cell phone is telling me that 2 minutes are up, so I'm going to continue. Feel free, obviously, to keep working if you want to take a look at that. So thinking about this task, this is a task that I did a couple weeks ago with a 7th grade class, and they were working on identifying expressions for given situations, and the teacher really wanted them to focus on context. And so we found that this task kind of forced that just by having a visual, where the kids did not have much experience with this standard, and so they were having to make sense of what was going on, and they saw how the tables were arranged and really used the diagram to generate some expressions. So here is some student work that I selected. If you look in the top left, the student who wrote 2x plus 2x plus 2 made sense of the problem thinking about the top row. So going back a slide, the top row being the 2 at every table along this top part. And then same for the bottom. And then the 2 on the ends were the 2 that were the extras that went on the end of the last 2 tables. So that was one. 4x plus 2 was another one that was seen a lot in this class. And you can see how the student explained it there, that 4x is how many people at every table plus 2, because there will always be 2 people on the ends. So they were considering all 4 people at every table and then the 2 extra at the end. Then there was a student who set up this expression and decided to check to see whether their expression fit what they had figured out for being the number. And they plugged in 57 to see what would happen. So this student had 4 times the quantity x minus 2 plus 10. So take a minute to think about that one. You may want to jot it down because I'm going to go back to the slide. 4 times the quantity x minus 2 plus 10. So where do you think that student got that expression from this diagram? And if you have an idea, go ahead and type it for Annie.
Yes, somebody please type something because I don't have an idea yet myself. Oh, good. A few are coming in.
I didn't have any idea when the kid wrote it at first either. So.
Do you want me to tell you what some people are thinking here?
Sure, that would be great.
Okay. So one person said the end tables each have 5 seats.
Okay, so these
Said,
5. Can you guys see my arrow, by the way, Annie? Can you see the
yes.
arrow that I have?
Yeah.
Okay,
He
good.
said
Okay.
all tables have 4 seats except the last 2, which each have 5. So that's the 10 total.
Okay, so we're seeing 5 on the end here, 5 on the end here, making our 10. 4 people at every table in the middle, except for those 2 end tables. So that's how the student thought about it. Honestly, in the moment, I just simplified that expression in my head and saw that it was equivalent to 4x minus 2. And, or I'm sorry, that I tried to simplify it in my head and see that it was equivalent to 4x minus 2. And then, so I was like, oh yeah, that works, and had to push the student to explain how it connected back to the visual. So back to that improv quote of yes and, a lot of teaching is improv and trying to make those decisions on the spot. So this is not an easy task, and we'll keep seeing that as we go through. So this was the student work that I chose. There was other student work in the classroom, but the teacher's goal was to really get them to think about constructing these expressions and making sense of them related to the visual. And so that's where I focused as I was going around and talking to groups and interacting with the students, was really focused on kids that were writing expressions. I did have some kids continue this diagram to try and figure out for 57 tables. There were some students that were making tables and trying to see a pattern in how X and Y were changing. So there were a lot of other things going on in the classroom, but again, the teacher's goal centered on this, and so that's what we were looking for when we were doing the monitoring and selecting. So then we start to plan the closure on the spot. And this is, again, really hard to do on the spot, but it really gets easier with practice. And thinking back to those 5 practices for planning, the anticipation was really key here, because the teacher and I had talked before the lesson about what are we looking for, what do we really anticipate that students are going to do with this problem. And so we kind of weren't taken off guard. We knew what to look out for and to collect along the way. So this is from my original list earlier. This is numbers 5, 6, and 7. Connect, close, and then practice and extend. So when we're thinking about connecting the selected strategies, connecting to the big mathematics ideas, and connecting to the lesson goals, I'm going to show you what we do with the student work. So when we're connecting, we want to share the key strategies. So those 3 students' work are the 3 that we decided to focus on. So that's the focus of our connection piece. Our job here is to really restate the lesson goal and organize this new learning into their heads. So we can do this in a lot of different ways, and there's a list on your screen of some of those different ways. We are going to focus on connecting different approaches to examine structure and then make individual thinking visible to the group. One thing with this is that when I first started doing summaries in my classes, I would just, the kids would come up and I would just ask them to explain what their group did. Sometimes I would question, the group for clarification, but didn't really get into those connections that were being made across them. So I wrote in this tip part that talk moves may be your best friend. There are lots of them out there, but some of the ones that have been working really well in classrooms right now are things like restating or making a connection between your strategy and someone else's, and then revoicing or repeating. So we'll look at some of those. So this was the teacher's plan for who was going to share. And this is the order in which she was going to have them share. So first would be this student, then the one who simplified this expression, and then the student who had kind of the outlier expression. And we had brainstormed ahead of time possible general questions that we could ask during the summary. And so you can see that this question is repeated all 3 times. How does your expression relate to the visual? Every kid is going to be asked that when they present. So it's kind of a predictable structure that it's sort of our softball that we're throwing at them first is just letting them talk about it. Then we thought about some other questions that could build off of that. So could you simplify your expression? How would that change how it relates to the visual? That would get this group to actually see this and have them think about how are our representations connected. Here, what is different about this group's expression compared to our first group? What is similar? How is your expression alike and different from the first 2 groups? Could your expression be simplified? So all of these questions are very pointed toward the lesson goal, but they leave the thinking up to the kids. So it's really tempting during a lesson summary, during this connection phase, for us to do all of the talking and for us to guide all of the questions. But we tried to brainstorm questions that would be open enough so that it would guide the conversation without taking over the conversation, and really leave room for the kids to make sense of some of these connections that they were seeing. I'm going to pause for a second. Annie, are there any questions coming in right now?
Just a few, and I don't want to get us off track too much with these, but somebody, like, when do you plan? the connection part of the lesson, like with these possible questions, is this something you planned in anticipation? And like, what if the student work surprises you and not what you anticipated?
Yeah. So yes and yes. So that both of those things happen. So the planning part is really these types of strategies. So we had brainstormed this one, and a couple of others that didn't come up in the class. We did not brainstorm this expression when we were talking in our planning session. So it's really, once you've chosen the task and you know your lesson goal, that's when the anticipation happens. So the planning of possible strategies. What do I think my students are going to do with this problem? And once you have those in mind, you can think about these questions. So at that same time, once we had clarified our goal and kind of we did the task ourselves and then said, okay, I could also see a kid coming up with this. I could also see a kid coming up with this. Then we tried to brainstorm this and we decided that we expected students to come up with some expressions. We didn't know which ones necessarily. And so regardless of which expressions they came up with, we could definitely ask these questions. So, you know, there are a couple like about being simplified and things like that that may or may not apply. But in general, we wanted the kids to make connections between these equivalent expressions and try to be able to articulate where they came from and how they connect not only to the visual, so this original thing that they were looking at, but also to each other.
So it's the students that are answering these questions. Are they like standing up and presenting in front of the classroom, or are they just sitting in their seats and you're sort of like going back and forth?
Mm-hmm. So it depends on the classroom context. Some classrooms who have document cameras have the kids just come up and put their notebook under. Other people who have iPads, if the teacher has one, sometimes they'll just snap a picture and project it on the screen. Some teachers have been using Class Kick, which is an app where students can be working on their iPads and the teacher can see each of their screens within the app. And so the teacher knows who to choose because you can see everyone in front of you and then just projects that up. But the idea is that however you get the work visible, you want it visible. Back in my day of early teaching, you know, sometimes that would mean kids writing it on a transparency or, you know, writing it on the whiteboard, or sometimes I would write it and say, you know, this is what I saw. Can you help me make sense of this? So as the takeaways, the logistics, you're going to figure out in your own classroom what works best and how to do that. But the big idea is that the student work is visible, so we can see what the student was thinking and what they wrote down. And then B, that we have some questions in place to kind of get them started, but the kids are explaining their expression. So I'm not going to walk up to the board and say, so look, this group said top row, bottom row, and show you, like I showed you guys, and point out they were thinking this and they were thinking this, and then these are the ends. I would have the kids explain that. So it's challenging at first. The kids need more scaffolding and more questions as they get used to taking ownership of the summary, but the ultimate goal is to really make it a student-led experience as much as possible.
Great. I think we're good for now.
Okay, great. So when we actually get to the kids connecting them, one of the ways that, you know, we might do this is if I'm projecting student work, I may put 2 of these up and say, okay, let's take a look at these. What's the same about these and what's different about these? And this allows me to kind of take a temperature of the room of if they are noticing anything about simplifying expressions. So, you know, in 6th grade, they're beginning to combine like terms. And so in this 7th grade class, we weren't sure if kids would immediately say, oh, those are equivalent because you combine like terms and the one on the left becomes the one on the right. Or if they would spend more time making sense of how it connects to the context. In this class, they spent more time making sense of it and really thinking about, well, this person on the left was looking at the top row and the bottom row, and this person was looking at all the tables. But they both had the people on the end, the 2 on the end. And so having kids kind of make sense about that, asking those questions from our anticipation about what's different, what's similar, could you simplify, how would that change how it relates to the visual. Then we would bring in the student's work. So how does this piece of work relate to the original problem? And then once they have a chance to talk about that a little bit, how can you connect it to the first two expressions that we saw? So the kids who produced this work would be up there answering, you know, how does this relate? How did you build your expression? And then we would ask them, can you connect it to the first two expressions we saw? A lot of times that's when other kids jump in too, where they want to say that they see the connection. There were other pieces that came up with this because this group evaluated the expression, that you know, kids had questions about that, where they realized, oh, I got 230 also, but I didn't get it like that, or I don't see how that worked. So we brought up kind of those two things so that we could connect some of the student thinking that was going on. So that takes care of this first part of connecting selected strategies, making sure that we're connecting to the big ideas. And then we come into the close. So we really want to, during the close, make sense of this math and give kids a clear takeaway. I've talked about this a lot with math talks, where at the beginning, when I was implementing math talks, kids would leave a math talk and really, if they had given an incorrect answer, I wasn't convinced that they actually knew that they were incorrect. Because a lot of times when we're having this type of discourse in our classes, we are creating the safe environment almost to the detriment of clarification on this is correct, this is incorrect. And so it's a balance that you have to strike. During the close, you want to make sure that they are solid on what you want them to know before they leave that day. What do you want them to remember or take away? So Mark Chubb, who's on Twitter and whose resources I put into a Google Drive folder that we're sharing with you, he breaks them into 4 general categories. And so basically it's content and procedural connections. So do I want students to be able to simplify expressions today and determine that they're equivalent? Then that's what the focus of my close is going to be. Or do I want them to choose one of the strategies and explain it back to me? So explain how Annie's group solved this, and put that back up and have them explain to me how that last group solved. Or which method do you understand the best? How would you explain it to someone else? You might want to focus instead on metacognitive processing. So if you've been working with kids on how to engage in discourse, you might want to do that. Describe how you contributed to our conversation today. What helped you pay attention to other groups when they were presenting? And then finally, it could be a misconception clarification. So what went wrong with this piece of work? Why didn't adding 12 work to connect this expression to the original picture? So a tip here is to really just have some go-to ideas that are at the ready so that you can use them anytime, because if we are being honest, doing this doesn't happen magically. It takes a lot of work and a lot of practice. And so I would encourage people to set aside time for the summary every day and really put in that work. But at the beginning, your summaries, your closure, it's probably going to be more general. And as you have more practice with it, then you get really good at grabbing that work really quickly, making these connections in your head. But it's very difficult at first to get started with that because you're doing everything on the spot. And we all know how difficult that can be. So in this case, we decided to ask this question: how can we determine whether each of these expressions fits the original problem? So we put back up the students, the 3 students that we had share. We put up their expressions again. These were just written on the whiteboard during the class. You know, we didn't have time to make a slide during the class while the kids were there. And then the kids were able to spend some time writing about this on their own. So they thought about it on their own, and then they talked to a partner about it. And then we took a look at their work after. So there's one more piece that they're going to write on this, and then we collected those sheets, and that gave us something to think about when we were reflecting on the lesson. So this is our closure piece. Then we move into that last part, which was practice and extend. So we really want to know, can you do this now? So it's one thing during a discussion where everything makes sense. So hopefully, while you're listening to me talk about lesson closure, it's sounding pretty sensible, and at least I hope so. And it's sounding doable and all of that. But if I then stop this webinar and say, okay, so now go do this tomorrow, you might have a little bit of panic, because it's like, oh, wait, it made perfect sense while she was talking, but I'm not sure that I can do it on my own. Kids feel the same way when they are working on math concepts in class. And so this last piece of practice and extend is checking to see that they really can put it into practice. And the extension piece, that question I have in the bottom in quotes is from one of my math idols, Chris Danielson, who created Which One Doesn't Belong, and is currently working on unit chat and all these things. He suggests that you close a lesson by asking, what are you wondering now? So ending with, can you do this? And what questions do you have? So an example with this lesson, we chose ahead of time some park practice items. The teacher was getting students ready to get into park pretty soon, and so she wanted to expose them to the phrasing of some of those. So we just flipped through the 7th grade park sample assessment that was online, and there are several different ways that you could approach this. So this is one example. This was not the one that she ended up going with. You can pose a couple of questions and have kids choose the problem that suits your current level of understanding, solve it, and show all work. So a teacher that I worked with earlier in my career uses the phrases working on it, getting it, and got it. And so working on it is, I'm still figuring this out. Getting it is, oh, I'm really starting to understand this. And got it is, I totally get this, I'm ready to move on. So in this example, we just want them to identify, are you working on it? Are you getting it? If you're working on it, solve that top problem. If you're getting it, solve the bottom problem. So I'll give you a second to just look at those two questions. So the students would literally just write this down. She uses index cards. You could use whatever works for you. If you have technology, they can submit these in ClassKick or another app. If you want to use paper, whatever. But they choose a problem and they solve it. They show their work, and that's the practice part of the closure. So that is one way that we could have closed this lesson. This way is another way. So it's a different problem, and it has a little bit different distractors in the multiple choice. And so the teacher would ask the students to solve the problem and show all of their work, and then ask a different question about this context, or make a connection to a similar problem you have solved. So instead of asking for the perimeter, the kids might write an area expression, or ask for an expression that represents the area. Making a connection to a similar problem you have solved, they might say, oh, I see here that options A and B deal with distributing. That's kind of like the piece of work we saw in the summary where we had 2x plus 2x plus 2, and then we had 4x plus 2. So any connection that they could make from this one to an old problem. The way that we actually ended up closing it was this way. So this is the practice piece that the teacher used. Work with a partner to answer the 3 bullet points. Then give Brianna advice on 2 ways to test for equivalence. And so the teacher felt that the kids had a good handle after the entire lesson and after the closure of either testing for equivalence by simplifying the expressions and seeing if they became identical, or plugging in a value and evaluating the expression to see if they got the same result. And so she felt that they were ready to go ahead and attack this with a partner. And then the kids turned in their answers to this, and they were able to, we were able to see kind of where they were at. So then the extend piece comes in. So after the kids had a chance to work together to practice with that sample problem, the teacher asked, what are you wondering now? a la Chris Danielson, and just said, take 60 seconds to write about what you understand from today's lesson and what new questions you can ask about identifying equivalent expressions. So it's just an open-ended free write. Take a minute and just write. And so it's sort of like a brain dump, is how I like to think about it at the end, where kids can write down whatever they're thinking about, and you have a pretty clear picture of what are they understanding and what are they wondering about before they leave. So I know that you are thinking, nobody has time for this much stuff in one lesson. This teacher had 60-minute class periods, and I will definitely tell you that when I started teaching, I had 40-minute class periods. And so I learned to give myself permission to think of a problem. So in my textbook, the problems, there's no way that you could do a problem and do it justice in 40 minutes, including a launch, an explore, and a summary. And so I gave myself permission to think about key problems as 2-period problems. However, if you're thinking about 2-period problems, so extending a task to take 2 days, there needs to be closure each day. So one thing that I did was think about, okay, if we can get through parts A and B during class today, that's a good stopping point where we can pause and summarize. And then when we come back tomorrow, we can start with parts C, D, and E of this task. And so some kids might get to C, D, and E on day 1, but most kids would get through A and B and we'd be ready to talk about that. So we'd kind of have a mini closure on day 1 and then a full closure on day 2. So the day 1 might be only that extend part of take 60 seconds and write about what you've learned today and ask questions, rather than a practice problem and that. There's a lot of different ways to do it. These are some sample pieces of timing that may work for the class periods that you're in. So I work with teachers who have 45-minute classes, 60 minutes, and then some lucky people have 90-minute classes. And so this is kind of how we break it down. Of course, each day is different. I don't think there's ever been a time that in a 60-minute class, the Connect took exactly 15 minutes, but it's just general guidelines that to help hold yourself accountable. I really believe that we make time for what we value. And so if you value this closure piece, you've just got to force yourself to leave the time aside at the beginning. And it's going to take a while before it gets really smooth and really seamless. But it's worth the investment at the beginning, because once you and the kids get really good at this, you'll make up that time. So I do believe that it's worth the investment. So I've included a quote here to kind of wrap us up a little bit. Holistic learning is the process of weaving the knowledge you are learning into everything you already understand. So when we think about students who really are excited about math, if you can picture one of your students who is just really always talking about math and always excited to share and things like that, typically in my experience, those have been the kids who are really making sense of math and weaving together this big picture. They see the beauty that we see as math teachers. And so closure and summaries can help us to help other kids see that same big picture and make sense of it in a way that they really get excited and want to participate and know more. So our key ideas, because this would not be a good session on closure if I did not bring closure. So the key idea is we really need daily closure. So thinking back to the memory piece, if you want kids to remember what they did in class, you have to help them build it into their memory and strengthen their memory of what happened. We want to remember that it's more than just summarizing what groups did. So don't just have kids get up there and say what they did and then sit down and call up the next group and say what they did and then sit down. You want to give some time for them to make those connections. It's a really key idea that new learning occurs during the close. So this isn't just wrapping up so that we can leave. This is really making sense. This is where they're making those connections and making it permanent in their brains so that they really understand how these big ideas fit together. And along with all of that, purposeful closure aids in strengthening memories. So I ask you, what are you wondering now?
So we do have a few questions. Is now an okay time to
Yep,
fire them
now
at you? Um,
yes.
one, you kind of mentioned earlier, I don't know if you had a slide about it, but I think you just sort of mentioned like talk moves, like teacher talk moves. So if someone was just sort of
Mhm.
wondering like if they wanted to get better at that, or what are teacher talk moves, or where can they read more about what that means?
Yeah, so there's a really good book called Intentional Talk, and I'm looking to the side because I'm sure it's in here somewhere in my office. And Elham Kazemi, and I cannot remember her. Oh, Allison Hintz, here it is. Let me grab it. I'm going to hold it up to my camera. This book really talks a lot about intentional talk moves and ways that you can structure conversations. Is that showing, Annie? I can't see myself on camera.
Yes, and I have that book too, and the teacher that asked about it is in my district. So if she wants to borrow it, I also
Okay.
have it on my shelf right next to me. So
Awesome. And then there's also a website called fosteringmathpractices.org. I'll add it to the resource list. I don't think I had it on there. Oh, that's after this, sorry. Oh yes, so here, fosteringmathpractices.com, actually, they have a whole bunch of instructional routines. Those of you who may participate with the Metro Chicago Math Initiative, where I work, we had David Weiss come in November to share with us this instructional routine called Connecting Representations, and it is built for lesson summaries. It's helping kids make sense of connecting different representations, very similar to the example that I gave today. So that would be something to check out. And they incorporate a ton of talk moves into their instructional routines. So if you look at the way that they have templates laid out, they're already built in. So it's a really good starting point for you to have a really clear structure to practice those talk moves in. And really, that's what it takes is practice, because when I started to be more mindful about incorporating them, it felt very unnatural and it felt forced, but now it's just part of what I do. And so again, practice makes better at everything.
nice, yeah. What about exit tickets? Do they fall into one of the parts of the lesson, or how have you used them, or teachers use them?
Yeah, for sure. So that practice and extend piece is really very similar to exit tickets. So the kids are writing something down and we are collecting them so that we can see what they wrote down and see how they were making sense of things. And my only caution would be, if you're going to do exit tickets, I would really think about, why are you collecting that information, and then what are you going to do with it? So we could do a whole other webinar on re-engagement and purposeful math talks and warm-ups based off of what you see kids write on their exit tickets. But you tend to get better information from kids when they know that that information informs your instruction, that they see evidence of their thinking coming out. If you want to collect the exit tickets, plan on how you're going to use it before you even assign it, would be my advice with that. And then Mark Chubb's blog post here, he has this never skip the closing of a lesson. He has a bunch of really specific exit slip prompt ideas in that blog post. So that would be one to check out for that.
Great. And then kind of speaking about tools, somebody was asking about, like, let's say you're not great at saving that time. Do you have any suggestions for just getting better at your own time management, or a tool that you use to make sure that you're leaving that time at the end?
Well, timers are my best friend. And, now in a coaching role, it's awesome because there's two adults in the room. And so we're able to keep each other accountable. But when I was teaching on my own, I would literally set a timer, and then we would just stop at that point. And sometimes I would say, okay, we're stopping and I'm going to give you 1 minute to wrap up what you're working on. And then we're going to come back together and close this for today. today. We'll come back to it tomorrow. And hopefully I had anticipated where that closing point might fall, but sometimes, either the kids go more quickly or much slower than I expected. So that's when some of those general closing techniques come in that we talked about earlier. So things like take a minute and write down what you're thinking. Where will you start tomorrow? Explain to someone how to solve part A. Things like that are very general, but help kids get down on paper what they're doing. If the closure of our lesson is like the bell ringing and then kids, getting their stuff together and standing up and leaving, then they probably are not going to remember very well what they did that day. And then the next day when they come back, it's more wasted time trying to figure out where we left off so that we can pick back up. So use a timer and have some general closure techniques in your back pocket that you can pull out if you look at the clock and are like, oh my gosh, class ends in 3 minutes. What am I going to do? Find something that you can have them do quickly that will also help them remember what they're working on.
Great. So let's say that there's some teachers that are watching right now and they're sort of like, okay, I want to try this, but they are teaching on a team of other teachers. Or there's some people watching that might be a coach, and so they want to bring this to groups of teachers. So, besides like giving them the link to this webinar, which they could do, right? Mm-hmm. That would be an option. But how do you sell this kind of new, scary way of teaching to teachers that you're working with?
Yeah. Well, I think that, modeling is really powerful when something is brand new to someone. When I think about any new instructional routine or practice that I've incorporated into my own teaching, I've always done it way better if I've seen it first. And so there is not currently a lot of great video out that I have been able to locate on lesson close. We are definitely working on curating some, but see if you can observe each other. And so invite them in to see you try it. The collaborative planning ahead of time is really helpful because then you're kind of both looking for things while the kids are working. It's really focused on the student thinking during the lesson. And then the closure, you can really plan it out ahead of time and just try it and see what happens. I've found that the biggest barrier has been this feeling that I don't have time. And so sit down and rehearse or practice ahead of time. I'm going to spend 2 minutes on my launch today so that I can save 10 minutes at the end for my summary. And then gradually you'll get better at it. Kids will get better at it and it will go more quickly. So I would say try to get together and make this happen together in someone's classroom so that you can practice and get feedback on it. And then once you get good at it, invite people to come and see you do it. And then again, the planning piece is really huge. So laying out, this plan, having anticipated student work, then they will see how it kind of makes sense. I also think asking questions is always a great way to kind of create this need. And so ask questions in a kind way about how are you currently feeling about the way your lessons are closing? What are you frustrated with in your classroom? What's something you want to work on in your classroom? And, if you can collaboratively kind of identify that this is an area of need, then it becomes something that, doesn't seem so threatening, doesn't seem so scary, and becomes something that you really want to work on.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This was so helpful and enlightening. And it's just so interesting to me too. Like, this is stuff that I have known about, but then just to hear it kind of presented in this way was really helpful. So thank you for doing this for us. And
great, sure. And
Twitter handle.
Yeah.
Definitely people should follow you and get connected with you because you have lots of good ideas to share.
Thanks, Annie. Yeah. And the resources are available at this tiny URL, so feel free, and I'm always open to chat. So reach out if you have any questions. I would love to talk more in depth with you about your individual context too.
Awesome. And I did share the link to this in the chat of this, and then I also will put a link to it in the follow-up email so if people need another spot to grab it. So I am going to go ahead and turn over the screen to myself.
Okay.
So I can wrap us up here. All right, so thank you everyone for joining us. As I mentioned at the beginning, there'll be a brief after webinar survey if you could do that for us. And then look out for that email coming to you tomorrow to get, if you attended live, you can get the credit. Just as one little commercial also for event going on in my district. If you are in the Chicagoland area and are interested in ed tech topics, I wanted to invite everyone to our conference called I Engage Midwest. So anyway, thank you again. Visit us at ictm.org to look into becoming a member if you are not yet. We would love to have you join us, and also maybe think about attending one of our webinars in the future. So we appreciate it, and we will talk to you guys soon. Bye.
Bye. Annie, are you still there?